It's Christmas 1941, 2 weeks after the Japanese attack on the US fleet at Pearl Harbor.
The British Empire and the United States are at war with Japan and Nazi Germany.
British Premier Winston Churchill is in Washington for talks with President Roosevelt. But how will the new alliance develop at a time of crisis?
Join us for some answers here on Churchill, the Finest Half Hour.
Welcome to this episode of Churchill, the Finest Half Hour. I'm Professor Richard Toye, and with me, he's battling through the snow in Tennessee to be recording today, is my good friend Dr. Dockter. And in this episode, we're going to be looking at the transformative year that followed the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, not only Pearl Harbor, I should say, other American territories too, which of course brought the USA into the war. And we're going to look at, in particular, Winston Churchill's extraordinary 3-week sojourn in the White House during the so-called Arcadia Conference, when the Prime Minister and President Franklin D. Roosevelt forged a working partnership being described by Churchill biographer Roy Jenkins as one of the most bizarre interludes in the history of heads of state or heads of government. Of course, President was the head of state, Churchill was the head of government. So, I mean, Warren, this is like a kind of iconic meeting.
This is a huge iconic meeting, and it's really interesting because, it's written about both on the British side, as you mentioned, Roy Jenkins. It's also, John Meacham has written on this. One of my favorite books on this is Partners in Power. And typically, the start date for when people think of the special relationship begins here at the Arcadia Conference. Now, we've been discussing, of course, the kind of lead up to that, Lend-Lease and Churchill on behalf of Britain trying to court Roosevelt and FDR. But after the attack of Japan, it sort of changes everything. So, as we had said before, Churchill went to bed after the 7th of December and later wrote in his memoirs that he went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and the thankful.
And that's right, because, of course, the Pearl Harbor attack, this was really bringing about the conditions which he had hoped for a long time, had been, as you say, courting Roosevelt. But I think what's interesting is what kind of happens immediately afterwards, because he could have stayed in London, right? I mean, that was an option. And he is determined to go to Washington. It's a very dangerous undertaking. He's going to have to do it by ship, and there's the risk of U-boat attack. And there are, people around him who are saying, don't do this. It's not only physically risky, it is a kind of a politically risky thing to do. But I think that sort of Churchill always believed, whether it was with Roosevelt or Stalin or Truman or other leaders, he believed that he personally could make a difference to the course of events through force of personality.
That's right. I mean, and David Reynolds more or less discussed that in his book on Summits and Summitry, framing Churchill felt that he personally had to go, which of course he did. And he did this by basically boarding the Duke of York on December 3rd.
I think we should clarify the Duke of York was a ship at this point.
The ship, the Duke of York, this is not scandalous. He boarded the Duke of York on December 13th. And of course, this is a difficult time because, there's a state of war. And basically, they were able to dodge the U-boats and so forth and cross the Atlantic and eventually landed in Norfolk on the 22nd of December.
And so Roosevelt then meets Churchill at an airfield in Washington, and Churchill is installed in the Rose bedroom of the White House. So, I mean, and that sort of becomes his kind of personal HQ in a way. People, obviously world leaders often stay in the White House, but for this length of time is very unique.
Yeah, it's a bit almost like your mate turns up and needs to crash at your house for a month, but like you're also world leaders. Yeah. And so they're having to kind of live together in this kind of domestic situation, which I think is kind of funny.
Somebody's got to write a sitcom about this at some point.
It's crazy to me that's not been written. And if you're listening to us, HBO or Netflix, Richard and I are ready to write this. It would be hysterical.
And so Churchill, of course, has got these difficult habits. I mean, this is why a kind of odd couple comedy would be good, because Churchill loves to stay up very late. He gets up very late. He we've said before, he works from his bed until lunchtime reading newspapers and dictating to secretaries and so on. And Eleanor Roosevelt, the president's wife, noticed that Franklin, who was not a particularly well man, it has to be said, as we'll see, Churchill wasn't particularly well either, but she thinks that this put a terrible strain on her husband, who had his own routine, which required him to be at his desk early on, while Churchill was staying up at night talking and drinking brandy until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning.
That's right. So FDR was very much early to bed, early to rise, the way he kind of ran things, and that's how he administered his White House. So you can imagine this sort of odd couple living together. And there's a thing we've all read about, Richard, that I'm interested in. Did this really happen? The famous bathroom incident.
We'd really better say what this story is. So that the story is that Churchill loves to get in the bath, and he would even dictate to secretaries when he was in the bath, and he wasn't really self-conscious about the fact that, some of the time he'd be naked or just in his underwear or wrapped in a towel or whatever.
I'd really love to imagine him just sort of playing with battleships, like toy battleships in the bath. He's got a secretary, he's occasionally dictating something, but then he's also like maybe acting out, the Battle of Trafalgar or something.
Absolutely. But there's a good source for the bathroom incident, which is a man called Patrick Kinner, who was one of Churchill's private secretaries, who was sometimes taken along on these trips because Churchill's usual secretaries were female, and that taking them on board a destroyer crewed by men without any female bathrooms was seen to be a problem. And so on this occasion, he's been in the bath, he's got out of the bath, he's wandered back to his bedroom wearing nothing but a robe or a towel, and in comes President Roosevelt in his wheelchair, and there in front of him is Churchill stark naked. And there are different versions of exactly what he said, but the sort of most famous version is he says, "The Prime Minister of Great Britain has nothing to hide from the President of the United States." And so, it's kind of one of those legendary stories, but, Pat Kinner was definitely there on this occasion. It's very difficult to see any reason why he would have decided to make up a story about a naked prime minister. And, so I think it's legit.
Which I've always thought was very funny.
But of course, there are sort of more important things going on. It's worth saying that there is a lot of public relations also, so that the two leaders, Churchill and Roosevelt, on Christmas Eve, 1941, they kind of preside over the lighting of the national Christmas tree in Washington. Roosevelt introduces Churchill as my old and good friend. Well, as we saw previously, they actually had only met once before, and it hadn't necessarily gone too well. They'd corresponded a lot, which maybe gave some legitimacy to saying he was a good friend. But above all, this was them presenting a united front.
And I think that's a really important thing that Roosevelt is saying to the other Americans, look, he's one of us.
And, also one should say that, Churchill wasn't just there to discuss military operations. I mean, that was a very important part of the story. And the liaison between the British and the American militaries about what the strategy is going to be and what the priorities in the war are going to be. But it is also this public relations exercise. And one sees that above all with Churchill's address to Congress on and so that is, I would say, the most famous speech he gave in the United States.
And didn't he begin that speech saying something to the effect of that had he been born in America rather than in Britain, he would have probably gotten there on his own anyway?
Yeah. So, I mean, he's very good at kind of warming up the crowd. And bear in mind that it's really only a matter of very few weeks America has been in the war, that you've had people who, up until the outbreak of war, were isolationists who didn't want America to be involved and who were very suspicious of Britain and of its empire. But bear in mind, there's the immediate audience of the senators and the congressmen. And then there is the American national audience, and there is a global audience. So people can actually follow this back in Britain as well.
So Churchill must have been under an enormous personal strain, knowing that the language is so important, him being seen with Roosevelt is so important. He's keeping probably a crazy schedule, doing all the kind of publicity stuff that he can, working on the speeches, being aware of Congress, also having to kind of match with FDR. And all of this must have taken a toll on him personally, don't you think?
Well, I do. I mean, I think that you know, he kind of does pull off this personal triumph with the speech. There's this famous paragraph or few sentences when he talks about the Japanese aggression. What kind of a people do they think we are? Is it possible they do not realize that we shall never cease to persevere against them until they have been taught a lesson which they and the world will never forget? And I suppose what's interesting there is he's saying what kind of a people we are, which is kind of implying unity between Britain and the American people, and or perhaps the sort of what he would have called the English-speaking peoples as a whole.
Yeah, I was about to say that's echoed in his books later on with the history of the English-speaking peoples.
Right. And, also we can see that the immediate response of the people in Congress, the senators and the congressmen, they're standing up, they're cheering, they're waving, sort of brandishing papers and so on. So it goes pretty well. When he gets back to the White House, Roosevelt hasn't been there but has listened on the radio, and Roosevelt says, "Oh, that was quite good." And there's like a different, I think it depends how you read it. I mean, like the sort of the British interpretation of quite good is like, that was probably satisfactory. The
No,
American reading of quite good might be, actually, you thought it was good.
no. So this is an interesting thing, right? Because I've used this story to tell people what it's like being an American in Britain and about you and me working together. So I would give you a draft of something and you'd write back, "Well, it's quite good." And I'd think, "Oh, great." And then I came to find out that you're like, no, I mean, it's quite good. It's not, it could be better.
Well, these are the nuances on which international diplomacy hinge.
To be fair, you've never seen me naked in the bath either. So
No, and I don't particularly want to. But, so go seriously on your point about the strain, then yes, we know it was a very serious strain. I mean, Churchill, not a particularly healthy person.
you could drink.
People maybe exaggerate how dependent he was on alcohol, but he certainly smoked pretty regularly. He wasn't taking a whole bunch of exercise. And of course, he was in his 60s by this point. So it's not really surprising that something then went quite badly wrong.
Yeah. When he traveled with a sort of entourage of people,
Yeah.
and one of those people included a man named Lord Moran, who was his private medical doctor. And he diagnosed what he referred to as a coronary insufficiency, which is effectively a very minor heart attack.
Yeah, it's basically a minor heart attack, which was going to require theoretically 6 weeks in bed. But, this is going to be a problem if Churchill has to go to bed for 6 weeks during this major summit in America.
Right. I mean, he obviously is not in a position where he can be on bed rest for 6 weeks.
So Moran kind of faces this dilemma that, if he announces that the Prime Minister has had a heart attack, that's kind of disastrous. On the other hand, if he doesn't tell Churchill what has happened and he carries on working and he has a heart attack and dies, then that's going to be disastrous as well. And Moran is going to get the blame for not having told him to rest. So he kind of has to, take a very quick decision. He basically says to himself, I think, well, I'm going to cover this up. I'm not even going to tell Churchill the truth about this. And so Moran decides to conceal the truth from Churchill and from the world. And this means that Churchill is going to continue with his program. And it remains a real question of, can he physically struggle through this sequence of key events which are going to be so crucial to the future of the Anglo-American alliance. And I think we should probably tackle those events after the break.
Sounds good, Richard. Welcome back to Churchill the Finest Half Hour. I'm Dr. Warren Dockter, and joining me is my compadre, Professor Richard Toye. And we were just talking about the special relationship between Prime Minister Winston Churchill and President Franklin Roosevelt. Now, before the break, Richard, we were just talking about Churchill's health and how he had had potentially a heart attack, which had been kind of covered up by his doctor. But did Churchill slow down at all after this potential moment?
Well, I think you can probably guess the answer to that one, which is no, not in the slightest. He went to Ottawa to address the Canadian Parliament. And again, he's just very recently pulled off this brilliant speech to Congress. And he manages another very memorable, quotable speech. And he remember, of course, that Canada has got a significant French population, so there's always an interesting dynamic there. But Churchill, in his speech, delivers this famous rebuke to the French generals at the time of the capitulation in 1940. And he says, I warned them that Britain would fight on alone. Their generals told their prime minister and his divided cabinet, in 3 weeks, England will have her neck wrung like a chicken. And Churchill sort of pauses and he says, some chicken, some neck. And so again, one of these speeches which is filmed, photographed, goes around the world. And it's during this trip that one of the most iconic images of Churchill is produced.
That's the one by Joseph Karsh, right? The one where he looks angry and supposedly, and maybe this is true, he took the cigar, he yanked the cigar out of Churchill's hand, and he sort of captured this face where he looks very pugnacious.
Well, that's right. I mean, it definitely is true. And bear in mind that Karsh didn't have a lot of time to take the photographs. He took two. And after he whipped the cigar away, then Churchill makes this angry expression. He gets that famous, iconic kind of roaring lion photograph. And then, or bulldog photo, if you will. And then, of course, he realizes what Karsh has done in order to sort of get a rise out and get the photo he wants. And then he smiles and sort of takes another photo. And of course, that's not the smiling one is not the one that becomes famous. It doesn't particularly fit with the narrative in the same way.
So Churchill's bouncing back and forth, but there's serious things confronting him at this point. So, they're at the Arcadia Conference. Churchill and Roosevelt have agreed that they would deal with Germany in the first instance before switching over to Japan, despite America coming into the war because of Japan. But it's at this moment Churchill faces some serious headwinds.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, it's kind of worth dwelling on that because after Ottawa, Churchill goes back to Washington for a while and is engaged in those military discussions. Historians sometimes say, well, that sort of on paper, there was a Europe first strategy, but that in practice, the Americans really kind of deployed their forces wherever it happened to suit them at a sort of a given moment. But I think the key point of the dynamic is that even though this sort of Europe first strategy had been in theory settled at the Arcadia Conference, there was always the risk that the Americans might pull away from it. And so that was a constant part of Churchill's dynamic with Roosevelt, was to try and keep him on board on a Europe first strategy as far as possible, bearing in mind, of course, that at this stage of the war, launching a direct invasion of mainland Europe was basically inconceivable. So we should say, of course, that 4 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the Germans decided to declare war on the USA as well, which was another gift to Britain, actually, because nothing was really forcing Hitler to do that. So in spite of that, in the Far East for Britain, there is in fact a very bad news as the Japanese advance, and the British have clearly underrated the potential strength of the Japanese forces.
And so the collapse of Singapore, I mean, that's an enormous blow. Didn't Churchill say it was the sort of greatest or worst defeat in British history?
He certainly described it as an imperial defeat. He gives a speech really mid-February, just after the surrender of Singapore. Bear in mind, there'd been this assumption that Singapore was this kind of impregnable fortress, and it's been sort of overwhelmed incredibly quickly. And so, although, Churchill, we know he had great rhetorical skills, but on this occasion, I won't say they necessarily failed him entirely, but because of the situation that he was in, the ratings of what people thought of his speech were kind of much lower than usual. And when things were going very badly, people naturally enough got depressed, and they would say things like, well, speeches are all very well, but what about action?
But in America, the American audience or the American people see this, and they must also think, God, the British can't even hold their empire together. And he's facing currents from FDR to even think about decolonization at this point as a part of the original Atlantic Charter. Walter Lippmann, who is an American columnist, argued that the war in the East should not be for the restoration of the white man's empire.
Right, exactly. And so this sense of the failure of the empire, the humiliation, if you like, I mean, it's felt in Britain and is also something which in America increases this pressure, including from Roosevelt, on Churchill in the direction of decolonization. And Churchill, when he has conversations with Roosevelt in which Roosevelt presses him over moving towards Indian independence, Churchill basically, for want of a better phrase, goes off on one, and Roosevelt doesn't kind of in person subsequently kind of return to that theme. Churchill stands up for what he believes in, even though many people see his outlook as being very antiquated, and that the fall of Singapore has kind of revealed the inadequacies of the British imperial outlook.
Right. And so those are the problems for Britain in Asia. But there's another significant issue that occurred for Churchill and the British, and not just the British, but the Allied powers during his second visit to Washington, which is in June 1942.
Right. So the first half of 1942 is pretty horrendous for Churchill and for the British government and for the whole military situation that the British are facing. He is in political trouble at home. There are a couple of no confidence votes against him during 1942. They don't result in a large number of votes against him, but there's always the possibility that something might spiral out of control and that a sort of a mini revolt might turn into something bigger. So it's when he's actually in the Oval Office in June 1942 that he gets a telegram reporting the surrender of Tobruk in North Africa, which is a staggering blow to Britain's prestige. And there are even suggestions in American newspapers that, this could lead to Churchill's fall as prime minister. But Roosevelt is sympathetic, actually, in this situation.
Right. I love the fact that to sort of, it was almost like Churchill came to us when we needed help. I'm going to come in and swoop in and save Churchill. So he offers Churchill some amount of Sherman tanks to go to North Africa to help the British there in North Africa.
So I think it's 350 Sherman tanks that are sent to reinforce the British in Egypt. And certainly that's something that Churchill appreciates. But of course, there are big differences over broader strategy between the US military planners led by General George Marshall and the British, because Marshall is wanting a direct cross-channel invasion of France as early as 1942.
Right. But Churchill has other ideas about potentially opening up a second front in what he described as the soft underbelly of Europe, or the soft underbelly of the Axis through the Mediterranean. But this is something that historians focus on, his almost kind of obsession with this, because of course they did this in the First World War and it turned into Gallipoli. So this is a kind of, maybe Churchill sees a way to almost redeem a previous strategy, is how some people have framed this. And I think that's important to remember, that this is in the mix of these discussions.
Yeah, I think, of course, he was actually right that sort of such an early invasion of France would have been disastrous. And bear in mind, of course, that this is something where the USSR is kind of the third partner in this relationship, and they desperately are urging a second front on mainland Europe. But of course, Operation Torch, that is, say, the invasion of North Africa, which is what Roosevelt actually agrees to as the primary Allied objective for 1942. So Roosevelt does really back Churchill on this point at this particular moment. But kind of by late 1942, Churchill is frequently referring to himself as the president's loyal lieutenant, which is probably politically useful in terms of American politics.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, is that it's very useful in the United States, probably less useful in Britain. But and another thing you pointed out, I mean, once Russia enters this alliance, to Joseph Stalin's credit, which is a very rare phrase you'll ever hear from me, he's consistently like, guys, I need another front. I need another front. I mean, in almost every communication, he's saying, you've got to open another front and take pressure off of me. And, Churchill, I think, is very cognizant of that. Marshall's wanting to plow through. I agree with you. I think it would have been a devastating move to try to open up a second front and have the Normandy landings this early on. But Churchill, of course, is very cognizant that he's trying to also placate Russia.
So what we end up with, of course, is that the torch landings are successful. There is also, of course, the Battle of El Alamein, which is a great British success over Rommel and his German forces. But there's a political crisis which emerges in the aftermath of the torch landings. And this is the fact that the Allies do a deal with a character we've mentioned before in a previous series, the admiral of the Vichy regime at this point, Admiral Francois Darlan.
Right, who is a recurring character. But Churchill didn't really want to do this deal, right? He even referred to it as a hateful decision.
Right. But I guess what's crucial is that Darlan agrees to a ceasefire in exchange for being named High Commissioner for North Africa. So he basically swaps sides in a fairly transparent way. And this is something which goes down extremely badly with the British and American public.
So Richard, how did the Free French feel about this? What did de Gaulle think?
Well, obviously General de Gaulle, as the leader of the Free French, his steam coming out of his ears doesn't really begin to describe it. And so you've got this really difficult public relations disaster, really, to put it like that. And Churchill calls a secret session of the House of Commons. He calls this a sort of a hateful decision. It's just a sort of a temporary expedient necessary to save Allied lives. On the other hand, of course, Roosevelt took a slightly different view because he saw de Gaulle as a sort of a dictator in waiting and had always been willing since 1940 to sort of keep talking to Vichy, so he wasn't really bothered. But the problem is solved because a young man takes it into his hands to assassinate Darlan, succeeds in doing that. He probably expected to be hailed as a hero, but instead he is quickly arrested and kind of within a matter of days executed. And so that kind of deals with the immediate issue, and it certainly would have been very problematic and difficult. We just had Darlan continued in post, then the crisis, which was serious, could have become catastrophic.
Right, but as it was, between the torch landings and other Allied successes in the second half of 1942, Churchill has maybe a positive message to share with the public. And on one occasion, he does. That is the Mansion House speech of the 10th of November.
It's just worth telling people, the Mansion House, sort of important building in London where prime ministers and other politicians regularly give kind of big set piece speeches.
Right. So the Mansion House speech, which Churchill gives on the 10th of November, 1942, is where Churchill can take a victory lap about winning the Battle of El Alamein and about the success in North Africa and the torch landings. And this is effectively when they were able to turn the tide and start pushing the Nazis out of North Africa. And so Churchill's able at this moment in Mansion House to declare this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
To Roosevelt's former Republican challenger, Wendell Willkie, who's sort of going around the world sort of promoting a kind of decolonization or anti-British Empire agenda. And so Churchill is sort of using this moment of maximum strength. He's been on the back foot for so much of 1942. He's vindicated in terms of his military strategy in North Africa. It's gone well. He's pretty much on the top of the world at this point. And then he's using this to essentially kind of stick a finger up to those who are pressuring him in the direction of decolonization or sort of anti-imperial agenda.
You can still see him in this moment of strength. And I think you're right that that's super important for him to dig his heels in and say, look, it's about the British Empire.
So less than a year previously, Churchill had been in the White House. He'd had this pretty serious health condition, at least a minor heart attack, but he managed to use that time with the Arcadia Conference to cement the alliance with the United States. And by this point, at the end of the year, the turn of the tide, as he called it, was finally happening in the wider war. But there were still underneath the surface of this friendship or apparent friendship between Roosevelt and Churchill, there were these seeds of post-war conflict, particularly over imperialism, and also, as the next year would show, over the role of the Soviet Union and its ambitions. And so, as we'll look at in the next episode, Churchill's role was transitioning from being the suitor of neutral America, as he had been in 1940 and 1941, to being the loyal lieutenant of a superpower whose resources now dwarf those of the British Empire. So the alliance between the British Empire and the American Republic has taken shape and is seeing success on the battlefield.
The new challenge for the Allies is to move firmly onto the front foot.
But how will Britain and Churchill respond as the United States becomes very much the senior partner?
The wartime story of Prime Minister and the President continues next time here on Churchill, the Finest Half Hour.
But in the meantime, KBO.